welcome back to the Community Agriculture Project podcast. I'm your host, Emily, and if you're new here, the Community Agriculture Project is a resource hub and documentation effort, and we document different agriculture initiatives and food sovereignty initiatives around the country. So we are here with a farmer up in New Hampshire, and I'm going to let him take it from here.
Hello, my name is RJ Noble. I am a hemp farmer in New Hampshire. We grow regenerative, no-till, certified organic cannabis, specializing in CBD and CBG-rich varieties. Our first farm was here in the heart of New Hampshire and the Heart of the Lakes region in Center Harbor. We're about a 10-minute drive from Lake Winnipesaukee, which gives us a really interesting biosphere. I mean, that's basically it. That's the start. You know, that's where we that's where the start. Yeah.
Okay, great. Welcome to the podcast. So this interview is actually revisiting our initial documentation of RJ's work here. So there's been a lot of progress in the past couple of years and a lot of changes, and so we're going to cover a little bit of that, some of the growth that's happened over the last couple of years, and just, cover some educational questions on the topic. So to start off, for our listeners, can you describe the difference between CBD, CBG, and THC?
Absolutely. So I'm going to go backwards from the way that most people describe cannabinoids. I'm going to start with CBG. It's known as the mother cannabinoid. It's a prerequisite to all other cannabinoids. You could kind of think of it as a funny assimilation, but like how all humans in the womb technically start female, and then based on hormonal changes, decide where they're going to go. And so that's actually very similar. So based on the genetics of the plant, it will become more CBD or CBG or THC rich. But CBG is what the base material, what eventually mutates into either CBD, THC, or a host of other cannabinoids, but those are the main ones. CBD, cannabidiol, is the main cannabinoid that we grow. So CBD is a psychoactive cannabinoid, but it's not intoxicating. CBG is completely non-intoxicating, but CBD can have more of a palpable effect on your endocannabinoid system. The endocannabinoid system being the natural system in our body that produces internal cannabinoids and responds to outside cannabinoid consumption. And then THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, and more famously known delta-9 THC, which is the decarboxylated version of THC. THC is in an acidic form when it's in the plant. All cannabinoids are. So you have THCA, CBDA, CBGA, and then they all have CBDV, THCV, all that. So it's a veronal, unlike mutation on the end of it. So it's like a little bit different. But THC is the primary intoxicating component in most cannabis.
And so what drove you towards really just growing CBD and CBG?
So
you grow for flower, right?
Correct. We grow for flower. We grow for solventless concentration, and we do a small bit of live hydrocarbon extraction. So, maybe not. We might not even end up doing the hydrocarbon because we have the option of CO2 extraction too. So, but primarily flower. I was trained and my skills are in high-end boutique flower. I honed those skills in Northern California, Southern Oregon, Southern Maine, now in New Hampshire, and I've been growing since about 2010. And I was growing the Harlequin strain back in 2011, which was one of the very first CBD-rich varieties that was getting wildly cultivated for flower. And I believe it was actually a cattle feed, like Swiss variety, and which I was told by a cheesemaker, hemp protein makes the best cheese. Yeah, it's like the best like milk proteins assemble when they eat hemp, and so
Interesting.
yeah. So little note for the cheesemakers out there and the dairy farmers, but so Harlequin was a 1-to-1. And so it was even distribution of THC and CBD, and I was one of the only people crazy enough to be growing it all the way back in 2011. Because if you told them you had cannabis that didn't get you high, they would throw it in the trash. But I was obsessed with it, and I had a very good response to a more even blend of cannabinoids. As much as I love high THC, it doesn't lend well to my ADHD, and I think a lot of people can relate out there. So I was always like a geek for CBD, and when I was actually growing in southern Maine in 2015, I actually started to acquire genetics from this gentleman known as Ringo. He did some incredible work. He was he was helping cancer patients, and he was a cancer patient himself. And he realized the potentiality of having, a really powerful cannabinoid that, didn't have intoxicating effects, I should say. And so he started developing basically what would be known as hemp now, but way back in like 2014. And so he had varieties of really high quality cannabis that had no THC in them at all. And so again, you had to be kind of crazy to like want to do this, but Ringo was a really amazing grower and a really great heart. I also in 2019, after I completed the Rogue Farm Corps internship in Southern Oregon, I worked for a farmer, Ben Joheim, who was doing large scale hemp cultivation, but with Korean natural farming. So most large scale hemp production, the quality is really low, and he was one of the first that I saw really do some high quality CBD on an appreciable scale on true acreage. And so once
How many acres?
13.
Okay.
Yeah, 13, and then we helped him harvest 49 more.
Jeez.
6 people. Yeah, we crushed 1 month. And so it's going. But what was it? A lot of people are gonna think that's impossible. It wasn't. It was just we worked 18 hours a day. So yeah, and there was quite a bit of mechanization on that farm too. But that was the first time I really saw how these like CBD varieties can really compete with the THC rich varieties. So a couple years later, as basically New Hampshire kind of decided on its cultivation policies, which kind of turned out to be none. Back in 2021, I decided to move back and start our first farm here in Center Harbor, here in the Lakes region.
And how have people taken to your products here?
They have taken very well. People are just excited that cannabis is being cultivated here on like any kind of a serious scale, and with due diligence. And so the response has been great. Just 10 minutes in town in Meredith, we are selling just in like 3 different shops, like right on the street. And so it's really interesting to be a hemp cultivator and to market your product, because technically it's considered produce, just like kale or oranges or anything. So we've gone to farmers markets. a lot of it doesn't necessarily sell in like a dispensary, even though we've started to do that as well. A lot of coffee shops, wellness shops, and stuff, and just a lot of people. A lot of people in New Hampshire can't handle super high THC. I think just because it's possibly because it's kind of a new thing here too. But I've had a lot of folks who were, in recovery, getting off substances and stuff, that really benefited from cannabis, but they didn't want to have any kind of intoxication. And so, like, I've had people come up to me, like, because I did a presentation at one of the shops that I sell at a few years ago. Someone came up to me and told me they were buying it from another shop, and I helped them get off like methamphetamines and stuff. Like, so, it's been really taken well by the community. They've been supporting us great. There's been no negative feedback. So
that's cool. And what has it been like to navigate just like the laws around cannabis, and how are those established or not here in New Hampshire?
Yeah, so cannabis is a somewhat special use case because so the 2018 Farm Bill legalized hemp and cannabis cultivation as long as it's below 0.3% dry weight per milligram. And so basically... Of THC, correct, yeah. And actually very specifically... decarboxylated THC, which is the Delta 9 form. Yeah, so yeah, it very specifically says that. And so, which is why you have people now growing THC cannabis and federally legal THC cannabis. It's not, it's kind of a gray area there, so we decided not to stick our feet in. But basically, in New Hampshire, in all states, they had until, I believe it was May 2021, or no, it was January 2021, to come up with their own cannabis laws, like around hemp. And so New Hampshire did a survey of all of its registered farmers, and only 3 farmers said they were interested in it. So they weren't going to build like $1 million system around the hemp laws. So they decided to forfeit their right to regulate the cultivation and sale of hemp. And so we run by federal USDA laws. And so pretty simple laws, again, since it's like considered like produce, they really, aside from we get an annual test, or if like we're growing inside or in greenhouses, you'll have to test every variety to make sure that it is not, as they say, testing hot, or like having any kind of appreciable amount of THC. And so, but aside from that, it's been pretty simple. The local USDA that we have to report our acreage to has kind of faced challenges with it, because I'm one of the only people in the state even growing. And so when I come to them and be like, okay, here, we're testing everything, get our acreage in and everything, it's the one time a year that they do it, and I'm their only customer, so they're not super practiced. They're not familiar with like maybe some of the terminology that someone that comes from the legal cannabis world would take right up on. Like, honestly, compared to the laws that people have to follow for regular THC cannabis, like, is basically none, and it's been really great because it makes it so a small farmer can become established, and it also makes it so and I think we mentioned this in like our previous interview, but it's like a really good option for like the small like food producer, because a very small scale you could produce like quite a bit of value, like 20 or 30x what you would get with vegetables, and you could run it on almost the same timing, the same cycles and stuff. So growing small boutique cannabis, and like I keep saying cannabis, but hemp, and these CBD and CBG varieties, which are really in demand right now. It's a great way for like food producers to like produce supplemental income. But like a little note on that, that's something I encourage people to look into as well, like with this, is a really funny thing happened where the CBD market grew and grew and grew after 2008 and then crashed because a lot of people weren't making money off it, mostly because they were producing really low quality stuff. And so now there was such a saturation and people got so familiar with CBD that now there's like a big demand for it and almost no supply. And so it's something that I encourage a lot of small producers to get into because it's very much a niche, especially if you're creating like really high quality product, and it's a product that could be sold all over the world.
Can you get more into the benefits of CBD?
Absolutely. So one of the main, I guess you'd say, medicinal sides of CBD is its non-steroidal anti-inflammatory properties. And so now basically all cannabinoids have this, and based on your delivery system, it can, and your variety of cannabis, it can manifest in many different ways. And so what I would say is basically, so your endocannabinoid system, the system that runs through your body that produces internal cannabinoids and will also respond to the consumption of outside cannabinoids. It's basically the system that runs alongside your nervous system and your immune system to deal with free radicals from the environment. And it's basically our internal cancer fighting system. Now you have cannabinoid receptors from the bottom of your feet to the top of your head, and you have CB1, CB2, and I believe they've discovered a CB3 receptor now. They used to think CBD only worked on the CB2 receptor. Now I think they're finding it spread out all over the body. But as far as how like the cannabinoids work inside your body, each like cannabinoid receptor is like, just like any neuron, it's a certain size and shape. And so the cannabinoid everyone's familiar with, THC, fits into there, but it's actually a little too big. And so they call it like an irritation. I don't think it's the right terminology, but it's what they use. Basically, the overstimulation that you get from something like THC is like part of the reason you actually get intoxicated from it. And CBD fits into that receptor like a key into a lock perfectly. And so that's why it's not actually intoxicating. And so because some people can actually have adverse reactions to THC, especially in these like super high THC varieties they have now. We've actually seen people like break out in rashes. Like, it's not super common, but we're starting to find our humans' upper limits for like THC now. There's cannabis hypermesis syndrome, where basically you consume so much cannabis, primarily THC, that you develop basically a nausea response when you consume cannabis. And so what I like about CBD is that it doesn't initiate any of those responses, and then like when you do need something like THC, it's a lot more effective, and does what you want it to do. But CBD is, sorry if you want me to keep going, but CBD is like really interesting, and all cannabinoids will do this, but if you're consuming it like, say, as a flower, or what like the USDA or FDA would consider a raw product, so like, we can certify our flower organic, we can certify any solventless concentrates or extraction as organic, because it's all considered a raw product. But if you start to run that through like hydrocarbons and stuff like that, it's then considered a drug. And so if you're consuming a raw product, you're going to have a lot more than just the cannabinoids in there. You'll have obviously terpenes and terpenoids, and then you're going to a lot of things that people are just discovering now. They're called flavorants, and so it's actually starting to become like more like the bulk of like the aroma and flavor of cannabis comes from terpenes, but these flavorants are what give it subtleties and differences amongst each other. And so these are basically volatile sulfur compounds, and so they have what's called the entourage effect, and it's can be applied to all natural products. But basically, when you combine certain ratios of these cannabinoids and these terpenes and these sulfur compounds and lipids and everything else that's in this raw plant, and you get what's called the entourage effect. So you could have something that has like the same amount of CBD in two different varieties, but based on like all these other compounds in them can give you very different effects. Something I had to learn and I had to educate, my customer base on is like say like a lot of people will be like, oh hey, I used to consume cannabis in the morning for my nausea, but I'm getting too high in the morning, so I want to switch over to CBD. A lot of people will like smoke CBD in the morning and then like fall asleep, because CBD is actually a lot more effective at like putting you to sleep than THC is. And THC can actually knock you out of REM sleep. It doesn't happen to everyone, but very common. Like you'll hear people that consume a lot of cannabis say they don't dream, or they don't remember their dreams. Well, a lot of that's because the THC is knocking them out of REM sleep. CBD will put you in REM sleep. And so people really will be like thrown off. They're not intoxicated at all, but they're just falling asleep. And so you have to find the right varieties that are good for the mornings and things like that.
Yeah. Miyabi Shields has done and published a lot of work around like finding that ratio for yourself. So Miyabi has also been on the podcast, and for anyone interested in that, I definitely recommend looking into their work. But I guess shifting more from the interactions of like these compounds in our body to more of like the ecosystem that is cultivated around the hemp. My other question that I was gonna ask was, aside from flower, like are there any other uses that you have of the entire plant, or like what happens to the plant after you harvest the flower, and yeah.
Okay, yeah. So here I'll address the industrial, the use of the other parts of the plant first. So we have several uses. I have a customer, or not really a customer, potential customer up in this area that's really interested in breaking down what we have and creating like a stucco or plaster to start putting up in houses here, and like kind of repairing like a lot of the old like 17th century houses around here and stuff. We also have some interest with pit moss, the company you introduced me to. I've actually had talks with them, and I'm going to be reaching out to them again soon, but they're very interested in actually using our hemp in a growing medium, a peat-free growing medium. And so what they've done is basically created like a medium that's like, it's like kind of made out of like paper pulp almost, but it acts a lot like cocoa coir. It's really great. And so, but they also have some types that have hemp fiber in them, which is really like a smorgasbord for beneficial fungi. And I've actually heard them talking about a product that one of the hemp farmers they've worked with before, they were actually pressing basically like little pucks of what is similar to a growing medium known as rock wool. And if anyone's not familiar with rock wool, it's basically spun, like stretched out and spun like volcanic rock, I believe, and it's pressed into a cube and then soaked with nutrients, and it's primarily what they use in like hydroponic production of cannabis. And so the potential for that is, the problem with the rock wool is there's it doesn't really compost. It's very usually like thrown in the trash, tends to grow algae, and there was actually in this last year one of their distribution centers for, I believe it was Grodan, but don't quote me on it, got an extremely bad aluminum, basically like it got corrupted with aluminum, and was screwing up a lot of people's plants and a lot of crops and stuff. And so with this hemp, you could actually just press it and go, And so that's a really high potential for that, and a really high potential for mushroom cultivation on this hemp fiber as well. So, because it's basically has the same kind of lignin content as like most hardwoods and stuff, but you can grow it in like 3 months instead of 20 years.
Right. Okay, interesting. So there's a lot of different potential markets for you to make the most of the product that's being grown.
Correct. We're even feeding the birds here.
Yeah, we were just out taking some pictures in the field, and the birds were on particularly the more lanky plants that have a little bit smaller buds.
Mm-hmm.
And you were saying that's probably because it's easier to access some of the seeds in there.
Yeah. So the farm we're at right now is like our primary breeding and seed stock farm. And so, so the varieties that we were actually looking at that the birds were picking out of, that's actually a variety from Syria. And so you could see in like the long, lanky buds that they have, that it, more reminiscent of like a wild variety. And yeah, no, I mean, those hemp seeds are packed with amino acids, and with most of the vegetation being dead around here this time of year, it's a smorgasbord for them. So we have like a whole row that, like, after I saw that today, I'm like, I'm letting the birds have that whole thing. That's beautiful. So
Right. Yeah, I guess let's talk about, because you have expanded to a couple different properties now. So I guess with the farm that we're at now, you say that this is your seed stock farm. Can you talk about some of the practices that you have here, just in terms of like what your interaction with the soil looks like here, and we'll just start with that for now.
Cool. Yeah, this is the fun part. We have considering our appellation, as they say, we have to take a few things into consideration. So I don't typically, based off the history of a piece of land, I don't necessarily take soil tests. Not to say it's a bad idea, but you could usually tell off of like the type of geology that's going on and the plants that are growing what to kind of expect with the soil. So the farm we're at right now is kind of at the foot of the White Mountains and the Olympia caldera. And so the mountains out here were literally carved out of glaciers like moving out from the last ice age. And so, and the mountains are made of granite here. This is the granite state. So it's literally called glacial till. It's just like the ground up rock from the mountains here. And what's really interesting about that is it's very salty soil. And so if people are familiar with all cultivation, but the question really comes up more, it seems like, in cannabis of growing with nutrient salts as opposed to organically, which just means growing with carbon as opposed to salts. We have a really interesting situation here where we have basically a natural salt bed, and there is a lot of mica formations coming out of the ground. So mica typically will only form when there's so much nutrients in the soil that the organic matter literally can't hold it, and it will crystallize as mica. And so we have this rich nutrient rich soil, but we needed to bring in microbes and a little bit of carbon to like actually utilize that. So the first year that we were here, we took a bokashi brand. And so bokashi is a microbial mix of facultative anaerobic microbes. And so facultative, they facilitate the process of decomposition. Anaerobic, meaning they thrive in an environment that is low oxygen, even though they can work in an oxygen-rich environment. And microbes, which I'm sure a lot of the listeners are familiar with, the lovely microbes that make up the soil food web. And so bokashi is, I really got to learn this because I talk about it all the time, but there was a PhD in Japan that developed bokashi, and it was kind of to help with the smell from like some of the fish markets and stuff, and because it's particularly good at breaking down animal proteins. And so it's kind of like a chain reaction. It starts with like the lactobacillus bacteria, basically, which is kind of the start of almost all decomposition in most organisms. And then it's followed by like a yeast and a nematode and all that, and it's a cascade that starts. And what's really interesting about introducing bokashi into like a native soil is that it doesn't displace the indigenous microorganisms. It works with them and teams up with them. So, or if there's not much there, it attracts those in. So, so we threw down bokashi bran, which are basically inoculated oat grains. And then we have this really fantastic manure we get from Mount Dearborn Farm in Ware. Extremely beautiful farm. They're growing all kinds of species of animals on like 800 acres, I think, or something. It's huge. And basically they bring me their best manure. It's a blend of llama, alpaca, sheep, goat, and a pinch of turkey manure. And it's really cool because this multi-species blend basically imitates the annual passing of a herd. And so like you usually, one animal usually follows the other and like eats the things that animal won't eat, because like people will see like animals on a pasture and they think they're just eating everything. Each organism is like very specific to the types of grasses and flowers and plants that it can eat, and so that's why you need to have a multi-species herd. So we basically glued this manure that was mixed with their bedding down, and the fungi went crazy, and basically kick-started the process of utilizing all of the salts that were in the soil there. And what's really interesting about having this sandy, salty soil is that it has like extremely high rate of drainage, and you see like our first field there is like also on a hill. So what ends up happening is you get like a crazy hydroponic effect. And so and if people aren't familiar with like hydroponics, that basically means to grow a plant in water. You typically will flood some kind of a tray with water, like nutrient-filled water, and then drain it out, flood it again, drain it out. And that's to saturate the medium with salt ions so they hopefully attach to root endings. But since we have like this natural system going on here, it's like a much more efficient system. And so basically, and it's like very important to basically layer things in the correct way. So we're not putting necessarily like hot compost or like compost derived from like a hot system. We believe in like composting in place. And so it's very much like we look at our beds as like the creation of a landscape. It's like, okay, how does like a forest turn into a grass meadow, into like a savanna or something like that? And so basically we're trying to turn our growing beds basically into pasture land. And so by doing that, you just get just a much more efficient system. And so that with the kind of unique hydroponic effect we get there produces super high quality buds, insane amount of trichome production based on the variety, very, very big buds like those lemon cookie doughs. You know, things that normally most growers would spend like thousands of dollars on nutrients and like biostimulants to make it do that. But those chemical messengers and like hormones are like naturally happening in the soil here. And so this was originally a horse farm. There's a restaurant in town, Mame's Restaurant, and we were recording this in one of the horse stalls that they used to be in. And so there was a whole lot of grass here. And so just like probably grass that wasn't even like from here. It was like brought in like from straw and hay, and then they like seeded it everywhere with their manure. And then we also, I don't know if you ever noticed, but like the land is covered in tiny strawberries. They're called Niçoise strawberries. They're like tiny and delicious. But It's everything that was growing here had very shallow roots, and so and I think that has to do with the horse activity that was here, and so what we did was bring in an appreciable amount of carbon and like very specific microbes to kind of help it bring it up to its full potential. It'd be very much I think if you were to like take a look at the soil under like a microscope, it'd be similar if you were to look at like the soil of a forest that you've had like hogs pass through, and like eat the acorns and like all that, because there's the types of manure, but there's also a lot of like wood loving fungi that are in our beds. And like especially with like the straw and stuff that we have in there, and then we also have the tarping methods that we use, which are one of my favorites. And so lots of farmers are doing this now. It's basically people are basically using it to like kill off like all the grass in an area, and people will do it for like 2 or 3 weeks, and it's pretty effective, and like you'll run a broad fork through it and it's great. But we like to actually leave the tarps on for months at a time if possible. And so what's actually happening with that tarp is you're basically creating an occlusive seal over the beds. It insulates it and creates an anaerobic environment. And so very similar to the processes that are happening in the fermentation of something like Korean natural farming, where you're basically pickling something to make it into a form that's bioavailable to a plant. And so what happens under those tarps, that basically, if you have the right mix of plants that you're tarping and you do it for long enough, it ferments it, and that would be very similar to your Korean natural farming or your bokashi or your IM01 or EM1. It's all the same, and what we try to do is, to our best ability, try to cater to the what you would call the local bokashi, the indigenous microorganisms that like get the party going around here, and have been here for millions and millions of years. And so when you do that, you get very specific notes and qualities of the cannabis coming through. So like at each one of our farms, we could be growing the same strain and get a much different result. I don't know if you noticed that the strawberry donuts here are much more purple than they are down in Durham. And so that's probably going to sound hilarious, but basically there is something that like a term that I think is really important for people to know, and it's just starting to go around, like quorum sensing. Now I probably don't have a perfect definition of this, but quorum sensing is basically, or the quorum sensing capacity of the soil is basically twofold. So one, it is a way for microbes in the soil to read the chemical history of the soil. So something happened in the soil, there's a resulting chemistry, they could read that resulting chemistry and knew what happened. And it's also basically attendance record for the soil. So they're like, there'll be like pulses in the soil that are like a result of like plants putting exudates into the soil, which is their chemical messages to other microorganisms for them to help work together. And so when these pulses like go out through the soil, there'll be chemical messages sent back into the mainframe of the soil, which is saying like there's this many of us and there's this many of us. And so based upon that chemical history and the attendance of everyone, they then decide as a community the next steps that will be taken in the soil and where the chemistry goes. And so what's really important about no-till and like the notion of like terroir and stuff is most soil you really couldn't say, like it really depends. So if you're tilling a soil, then you're basically resetting this clock that goes in the soil. So you basically, if you have soil that's undisturbed for 4 to 5 years, the microbes actually feel safer to start doing more complex chemistry. And that's where you get a lot of like your unique qualities to whether it be cannabis or food or anything, wine, that's what the one people are most familiar with. But, if you could have, like in France, they talk about like a certain part of the hill having like the right terroir, and it's because it has a completely different chemistry and stuff going on. But if you're starting from scratch, you're starting with fresh land, and the most disturbance you're doing to it is, a little bit of fluffing with a broad fork. Most of those microorganisms stay intact and will actually thrive more. That kind of goes back to being an actual steward of nature, to put in, in the part of regenerative farming, to actually not just sustain, but actually create more life, more biomass.
Okay, so here in Center Harbor, from here you have also in the past couple years started working in Durham, in a farm over there. So what are the differences between the farm here and the farm there in terms of what's the purpose and use of each of the farms, and how do the practices differ in the soil?
Okay, so it's very interesting. So down in Durham, our farm's in Durham, that farm we have in Durham, New Hampshire, it's kind of where our company headquarters is, and it's where we do most of our like grade A flour and the stuff that goes like on shelves and stuff. And the soil there is really unique. I wish I could remember what the soil type's called, but it's basically when that glacial till runs into an ancient ocean bed. And so we are planted, so we're about like a 15-20 minute drive inland from the coast in Durham. And so the patch of land that we're growing on the farm turns out was a giant tide pool, and we are planting on the edges of the tide pool where there isn't too much water, it's like staying stagnant. And so it's really interesting. Because we got an NRCS greenhouse, we got a grant for a greenhouse, and they had to send all kinds of agronomists and soil scientists out there to make sure we weren't like putting it on a wetland or anything like that. And so they had to take soil samples, and they were actually finding marine clay in the soil, and the groundwater was only like 14 inches down or something. So our roots are tapped right into that shelf, or that flagiopan. A flagiopan is when you have basically, you'll have soil and then maybe like a series of rocks, and then you might have like a gap, like almost like an air gap in the soil, and that will get filled with water, and it could be to your benefit or to your detriment. If you're tilling the soil, it's probably going to be to your detriment. You're probably going to get flooded parts of your field, because when you drive a tractor over it and use a rototiller, you're actually sending a shock wave down to the soil that bounces rocks and stuff up and disrupts that flagiopan. So that's another reason why people that till are constantly pulling rocks out of their soil and everything too. So we had to pull some rocks out the first year, and then never had to do it again. And sometimes, especially up here in Center Harbor, we'll be broad forking, and then we'll come across like a 30-foot boulder, and we're just like, we're gonna leave it there, and we plant around the boulder, and it doesn't disturb the roots or anything. They just wrap around the rock and start to eat it. So
yeah. What are some other differences in practices with the soil from there?
Yeah, that's good you brought it up too. One thing too, I'll mention too, shout out to New Hampshire Mushroom Company. I've been kind of working with them for a few years now. Shout out to Eric, the owner. He is a super amazing human being who believed in me right away, and just gave me 10,000 pounds of mushroom substrate. So basically the mushroom growing blocks. And so that has been, I'm gonna get back to Durham, but this is a crucial part. It's been the mushroom substrate that we incorporate into our beds has been really important in avoiding a lot of mold issues here in New England, which is one of the primary reasons people don't really grow outside in New England as far as cannabis goes, because the humidity can be very high here, and cause lots of bud rot, but we've been able to avoid the bud rot with these mushroom substrates. And then like when it's in the vegetative stage, we tend to spray it with a dilution of raw milk, and that keeps the powdery mildew away and everything. But what's different about the practices down in Durham is, so this last year we incorporated that same manure because we had it available. But I don't even think I'm going to do that again next year. Not necessarily because it didn't like benefit from it, but the soil is in such an interesting, pristine condition down in Durham. I think especially because we're growing in like ancient marine clay, that the tarping is really all you need. You know, we feed it a little bit in bloom. I was mentioning it before, but when we put the manure down this year, because we interplant like a lot of vegetables and herbs into our hemp as well. We typically have a rule of 3 species per bed, like minimum. And so we were growing a bunch of squash and potatoes and peppers in the hemp this year, and they didn't like really start fruiting until almost the end of summer. They got gigantic, but there was so much nitrogen in the soil that they weren't actually fruiting, and they had to wait for the hemp to eat it. Because hemp was such a hungry plant, it will literally eat almost anything you give it, and so it'll just get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so it's like why we ended up with those such big plants this year. But I think when you're in kind of a more mineral-rich environment, bringing in something like microbial activity and something like any kind of like a really good carbon source, but it's really hard to beat high-quality manure, which is an extremely hard thing to find these days. The guy I get my manure from, I know the guy that they get their straw from, and like all the way through. So, and that's the only reason I use it. I don't touch manure from anyone else because there's been a lot of issues with PFAS. So, you know, persistent chemicals, pesticides and herbicides that are sprayed on like a lot of feedstock for animals, and it passes through. There's a real problem with that in Maine a few years ago. Killing a lot of plants, and you know, otherwise, you know, cannabis is a hyper remediator, you know, so if your soil is toxic, that cannabis is toxic with that 100%. So, you know, again, another advantage we have here in New Hampshire is there's been, I won't say there wasn't industrial pollution here, because this is where one of the industrial revolutions started, you know, but for the last 200 years, the land itself has been pretty untouched, so the impurities of the soil are null.
Wow, okay. So, I think we covered a lot.
Fire. Yeah, love it.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing everything. And how can people continue to follow up with what you're doing, or maybe find some of your products?
Okay. First, where to catch us, you could get us on nhhempco.com or NH Hemp Co on Instagram. If you're in the New England area, you can pick up our products at several dispensaries up in Windham, Maine. Maine's Alternative Care is a medical dispensary that really loves our stuff. We also sell our products at Smoke Signals in Dover. They're having a consistent amount now. Crack Skulls Coffee in Newmarket, New Hampshire always has our pre-rolls on lock. And you know, shops and dispensaries all over New England will soon start having it. And hit me up on Instagram. I'll mail you an eighth if you want. I can do whatever I want because this is federally legal. So, so if you guys want a better price, just come straight to us, and we'll send it right to you legally.
Thank you so much for all the information, and congrats on the grant and the greenhouse.
Thank you.
Excited to see, you know, what continues to develop.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. All right, until next time, this is season 2 of the Community Agriculture Project podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Be sure to check out our Instagram updates and our website to see some of our other blog posts that we have been sharing. Yeah, be well.